right side and wrong side of fabric. With a print fabric like this, the right side of the material is the one with the print. The wrong side of the material is the back. Easy enough. With a solid fabric like this, there isn't a right and wrong side, so that it doesn't really matter. With a solid knit fabric like this jersey, there is a right and wrong side. It's just harder to tell. This one is the right side, that's the knit side. And then on the back, you can see that the stitches are not clearly defined like they are on the front, so that's the wrong side. The raw edge of the material is the unfinished edge. Finishing a seam means that you have treated the raw edge so that it doesn't fray. So one common way to do that is with the zigzag stitch. Another way to finish the seam is to use pinking shears. It won't fray. And my very favorite way to finish the seams is to use a serger. So what's the difference between pressing and ironing? Ironing is when you slide the iron across like this, back and forth. And pressing is when you place the iron down, hold it for a few seconds, and then move on to the next spot. In sewing, generally we want to press the seams rather than sliding it, because sliding the iron can distort the fabric, and when you just sit the iron down and hold it there for a few seconds, it sets your seam and it makes it stay how you want it to stay. I'm going to show you how and why you want to clip or notch your fabric, your seams, before you turn it right side out. So first I'm going to just flip it without any clipping. You can see how it's very bunched up. And in these seams, even though they look all right, there's a lot of bunching happening in there. And the worst of all is down in this lower seam right here in the inside curve. So I'm going to flip it back. So we'll start with those inside curves. And what we're going to do is clip in here. That's going to allow it to open up. So I'm going to cut right up to the stitching without cutting the stitching. So I'll show you what that looks like. So because we've clipped that, it allows that lower seam to open up. Now, to take care of the outer curves, we're going to take notches out, and those are basically little pie shapes. And this gives space for the seam allowance to open up so that you can have a nice smooth seam. Seam allowance is the measurement from your stitching to the edge of your fabric. That's a 1/4 inch. Three-eighths. Half inch. And 5/8. What is top stitching? So top stitching is a stitch that happens after your original seam. So I did this regular seam. Now I'm going to open up my fabric. Usually I would want to press this seam, and I'd be pushing the seam over to one side or the other, and then I'd top stitch on top of that seam. It's a decorative stitch, but it's also strengthening. You'll notice that there's always top stitching on jeans especially on the inseam. And often when you're top stitching, you'll lengthen your stitch a little bit just so that you have a bit more of definition in your seam. What is the selvage? Selvage is the two factory edges on a piece of fabric. What is the straight grain, or the grain of your fabric? The grain is a line that runs parallel to your selvage, and that is usually marked on pattern pieces so that your pattern ends up going the right direction. It matters a lot more in making clothing than in making bags, because in clothing you're counting on having a little bit of stretch in the cross grain. So the cross grain runs perpendicular to your selvage. So this across here is the cross grain, and you can see the fabric stretches just a little bit even though it's a woven fabric, and the straight grain barely stretches at all. And the last direction that we have is the bias. And the bias is basically a 45-degree angle. So say we had a square of this fabric and I drew a line from this corner over to this corner, that's going to be the bias. And if I pick up these two, it has a lot of stretch like that. So if I folded my fabric like this and then I cut something with the grain going this direction across the bias, it's going to turn my item into a stretchy thing. So you can do that with making garments. It really changes the way the fit is, and it looks really cool. What is gathering? Gathering is bunching up a piece of fabric by sewing 2 rows of basting stitches at the top edge. I'm going to change my bobbin to a different color because it's a nice trick that helps you to keep track of which thread is your top thread and which one's your bobbin thread. So I have a purple in the bobbin and a navy in the top, and I need a basting stitch, so my longest stitch length. You want to leave quite a long tail when you're gathering. You don't want to cut those short, and you don't want to backstitch. I have 2 rows of stitches. I'm going to look on the back and I can see the 2 purple ones. Those are my bobbins. I'm going to pick up the bobbin threads, pinch those, and I can slide the fabric along the top. And that is gathering.